The cop's siren blared in the distance, and the judge's eyes narrowed. He wasn't expecting any trouble on his way home. It had been a long day in the courtroom, but the last thing he wanted now was to deal with a traffic stop. He glanced at his rearview mirror, seeing the cop car pull up behind him. His hand instinctively reached for his papers, ready for whatever the officer would throw his way. The cop, a burly figure with a stern face, approached the car with an air of arrogance. The judge rolled down his window, keeping his hands on the wheel, his expression calm but alert. "License and registration," the cop barked, his tone cold, almost hostile. The judge complied, handing over his documents without a word. He could feel the officer's gaze linger on him, a strange, uncomfortable energy hanging in the air. "Is there a problem, officer?" the judge asked, his voice steady. The cop's eyes flicked over him, and for a brief moment, something passed through his gaze, a hint of judgment, an unspoken assumption. He grunted, glancing at the license in his hand. "You in a hurry or something?" The cop's tone was dripping with disdain. "No," the judge replied, his voice calm, but something in his eyes flashed, a warning. "Just heading home." There was a moment of silence, the cop staring at the judge, sizing him up, as if trying to make a decision. Then, suddenly, the officer made an unexpected move. "You know, I don't like the way you're looking at me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're above the law?" The judge's eyes widened, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he took a deep breath, realizing exactly what was happening. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a challenge, a test of character. The cop's words had crossed a line, but the judge knew how to handle people like this. He looked the cop straight in the eyes, his voice unwavering. "I'm not above the law, but neither are you." The cop's jaw tightened. The sudden tension between them hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to break. But instead of escalating the confrontation, the judge did something unexpected. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout back or get defensive. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his seat, his posture casual, but his eyes never leaving the cop's. The cop blinked, taken aback by the judge's calm demeanor. "What's your name?" the cop asked, his voice now filled with suspicion. The judge didn't answer immediately, but when he did, it was with quiet authority. "It doesn't matter. What matters is how you treat people, how you see them." The cop froze for a second, his expression faltering. He looked down at the license again, but something in the judge's response had shaken him. He wasn't sure why, but something about this man didn't sit right with his assumptions. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The cop had expected someone to resist, someone to lash out. Instead, he was staring at someone who saw right through him. The judge's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, the cop felt a chill down his spine. He wanted to regain control, but it wasn't just the judge's calm that unsettled him. It was the sense of power, of authority, that seemed to emanate from the judge without him even raising his voice. It was the kind of power that wasn't rooted in force, but in something much deeper. And then the cop realized, it wasn't just the man in front of him who had the power. It was the truth that lay beneath the surface, the truth about who this man really was. And that truth would shake him to his core. But what happened next was something the cop never could have predicted. The cop stood still for a moment, the unease growing within him. His fingers tightened around the papers, but he didn't know what to do next. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating, and the more he stared at the judge, the more something felt off. This wasn't a regular traffic stop, and it was becoming increasingly clear that this man wasn't going to react the way the cop expected. The judge could sense the officer's discomfort, but he remained unfazed. He leaned back into his seat, his calmness radiating with such intensity that it felt almost like a challenge in itself. He knew that any moment now, the officer would make a decision, either escalate or retreat. But the judge didn't plan on making it easy for him. "You're not going to find anything wrong with my papers," the judge said, his tone still soft, almost conversational. "But you might find something you didn't expect about me." The cop blinked, thrown off by the statement. "What's that supposed to mean?" he snapped, his bravado slipping. His hand hovered over his belt, ready to reach for his gun if the situation demanded it. But the judge didn't seem like the type to make a scene. The judge exhaled, his gaze unwavering. "It means you're about to learn something about me that you'll never forget." A chill ran through the cop's spine, but he tried to mask it with a scoff. He stepped back, eyeing the judge suspiciously. "Yeah, right. And why should I care?" The judge's eyes locked with the officer's, his gaze steady and unwavering. It was as if the weight of 1,000 unspoken words hung in the air between them. The cop felt it then, this man had power, and it wasn't something you could see on the surface. There was something in his demeanor, something that made the officer feel small. It was like the judge had already seen it all and wasn't afraid of what was about to come. The officer took a step back, unsure of how to proceed. His instincts screamed at him to keep pushing, to force a reaction, but something was holding him back. This wasn't going according to plan. Without warning, the judge shifted in his seat, and the officer tensed, anticipating a move. But instead, the judge simply reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a small card. He handed it over to the officer without a word. The cop stared at it, confusion spreading across his face. He took the card and glanced at it briefly. It was an official card, but the writing on it sent a wave of disbelief crashing over him. His eyes widened, his heart skipped a beat, and he froze. The card identified the judge as a high-ranking judicial officer, but that wasn't what shocked him. It was the fact that the card had a seal on it, a seal that he recognized all too well. You're a judge," the officer stammered, his voice cracking slightly. But I thought you thought I was just some regular guy," the judge finished for him, his voice laced with a quiet authority. "I'm not the kind of man you can judge by your own standards. I've spent my life fighting for justice, and I'm not afraid to stand up against what's wrong. Even if it means standing here, facing you." The cop stood there, his mouth slightly agape. His mind raced as the weight of the revelation settled in. This wasn't just some ordinary driver. This was someone who held the power to change lives, someone who had seen the flaws of the system from the inside out. The officer's confidence began to falter. He had crossed a line, and now he could feel the consequences of his actions creeping up on him. For the first time, he wasn't sure how to navigate this situation. The judge, however, wasn't finished. He could see the officer struggling with his own pride, and he wasn't going to let the moment slip by without making it count. He spoke with the same steady calmness that had held the cop in place. "You've treated me with disdain, but it's not just me you've disrespected. It's the very idea of justice. And you're about to realize that disrespect has consequences. The question is, are you going to learn from this, or are you going to let your pride keep you from seeing the truth?" The cop was stunned. For a moment, the words hung in the air, and all he could do was stand there, trying to process what was happening. His internal battle was raging now. Could he continue to defend his actions, or was it time to face the truth of his prejudice? But before he could respond, the judge spoke again, this time with an air of finality. "I'm going to give you a choice. You can continue to live in the comfort of your assumptions, or you can see the world through a new lens. The decision is yours." The officer swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between the judge's calm expression and the weight of the situation that was closing in around him. The choice had been laid out in front of him, but would he take it? The cop stood there, the weight of the judge's words pressing on him like an invisible force. His heart pounded in his chest, and he felt a mixture of confusion, shame, and something deeper, something that he couldn't quite put his finger on. He had always prided himself on being in control, the one who held the power in every situation. But right now, everything he thought he knew was slipping away. The judge's calmness was unsettling. The officer was used to seeing people panic when confronted with authority, to watching them squirm under the pressure. But not this man. The judge stood as a rock, solid, unyielding, and indifferent to the cop's usual intimidation tactics. For the first time in a long while, the cop felt small. It wasn't just the judge's words that unnerved him, it was the quiet confidence that radiated from him. Something about the way he carried himself made the cop feel as if he were the one being judged, as if all his years of training, all his assumptions about people and power, were suddenly meaningless. His hand, still clutching the card, trembled slightly. He quickly shoved it into his pocket, trying to shake off the feeling of vulnerability that had crept over him. His usual bravado felt hollow, the walls he'd spent years building around himself beginning to crumble with each passing second. "I've met plenty of people like you," the cop muttered, trying to regain some control, but the words felt weak, even to him. "You think you can just tell me what to do? But I'm not some guy off the street. I'm a cop." The judge didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. His eyes remained steady, watching the officer closely, as if waiting for the moment the cop would realize something important, something that would change the entire direction of the encounter. "You're right," the judge said, his voice calm but firm. "You are a cop. But that doesn't mean you're always right. And it certainly doesn't mean you can treat people any way you please, based on what you assume about them." The cop felt a tightening in his chest. He wanted to argue, to push back, but the judge's words were like a mirror reflecting back his own biases and flaws. For the first time, he felt the discomfort of self-awareness, a realization that maybe, just maybe, his actions and beliefs weren't as righteous as he'd always thought. "What do you mean by that?" the cop asked, his voice more defensive than he intended. He could feel his control slipping, but he wasn't ready to admit it. "I mean that your assumptions about people, about me, are based on your own prejudices," the judge replied without hesitation. "You see a black man and assume things about him. You judge him before you even know his name. You treat him like he's less than you, just because of the color of his skin." The officer's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to snap back, to say that wasn't true. But something inside him was holding him back, something that felt like a knot in his stomach, a realization that was too deep to ignore. "You don't know me," the cop said, his voice quieter now. The anger was still there, but it was fading, replaced by something else. Something uncomfortable. "I've never treated anyone like that." "Really?" the judge responded. "Then why is it that every time you look at me, you don't see a person? You see a stereotype, a threat, an other, and that's not justice. That's fear." The words hit the officer hard. He felt his pulse quicken as a wave of guilt washed over him. It wasn't just about this moment, this stop. It was about everything he'd been taught, everything he'd believed in up until now. He had always prided himself on doing his job, on serving and protecting. But had he really been protecting people? Or had he been protecting his own narrow view of the world? The judge continued, his voice steady and calm, but carrying a weight that seemed to echo in the officer's mind. "You have a choice. You can keep going down this path of assumption and fear, or you can open your eyes to the truth. You can start seeing people for who they really are, not just what your own mind tells you to see." The cop didn't know how to respond. He had spent years building his life around the idea that he was right, that he was in control. But in this moment, with this judge standing before him, all of that seemed meaningless. He wasn't in control anymore. The real question was, could he change? His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but it wasn't out of anger. It was out of frustration. He wanted to fight back. He wanted to deny what the judge was saying. But the weight of those words, those quiet, undeniable words, had struck a chord deep inside him. Could he really continue to live with his prejudices? Could he ignore the truth staring him in the face? The officer took a deep breath, his mind racing. His entire world felt like it was shifting beneath him, and he didn't know what would come next. But one thing was certain, this moment had changed him. And no matter how hard he tried to push it away, he knew it was something he couldn't ignore. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and thick. The officer stood there, still unsure of how to proceed. His thoughts were a jumbled mess of doubt, confusion, and something else, a flicker of understanding he hadn't expected. The judge's calm, controlled demeanor had shattered the walls of prejudice the officer had built up over the years. Now, there was only one thing left to do: face the truth. The judge, sensing the officer's internal struggle, spoke again, his voice softer but no less powerful. "You're not the first person to look at me and see a stereotype. But if you ever want to walk away from this moment and change, you'll have to look beyond what you see on the surface. You'll have to understand what's really at play here, because it's not just about me. It's about how the world has shaped you, and how you've let it shape others." The officer felt something click inside him, a spark of realization that had been just out of reach for so long. He had always believed he was above the biases others held. But the truth was, those biases ran deep, not just in others, but in himself as well. He had been blind to it, unaware of how much it had influenced his actions, his perceptions. The officer felt a knot in his stomach. For the first time, he understood what the judge was saying. This wasn't just about a confrontation on the side of the road, it was about a system, a culture, a lifetime of ingrained prejudices. And no matter how hard he tried to deny it, he had been a part of it all. But before he could voice any of the questions swirling in his mind, the judge did something that left him even more stunned. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out an envelope that had been carefully folded. He handed it over to the officer, his expression unchanging. The officer took the envelope, unsure of what to expect. His eyes briefly met the judge's, and in that moment, he realized just how little he truly knew about the man in front of him. "Open it," the judge said simply. The officer hesitated, his heart racing. His fingers trembled as he slid the paper from the envelope, the weight of the moment bearing down on him. What was in this envelope that had to be shared at a time like this? He unfolded the paper slowly, and his eyes scanned the words written on it. It was a court order, but not just any order. This document had the judge's name on it, but it also contained something far more significant, a mark of authority and power in a world that the officer had never truly understood. The words on the paper weren't just legal terms. They were a statement. "Who are you really?" the officer whispered, his voice barely audible. The revelation before him was more than he could grasp at once. The judge didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, as if he had been waiting for the officer to come to this realization. "I'm someone who's worked my entire life to uphold the law. But not the kind of law you've been taught to follow. I've fought for justice, for equality. I've seen the system from both sides." The officer felt a sense of guilt gnawing at him, the weight of the judge's words pushing him further into a corner. He realized that the assumptions he had made about this man were nothing more than the surface level of something much deeper, something he couldn't simply overlook. "I didn't know," the officer muttered, his voice cracking. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to the judge, or to himself. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know any of this." The judge nodded slowly. "Most people don't. They look at the surface and assume they know everything. But it's not about what's visible, it's about understanding what's hidden beneath." The officer's chest tightened, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly vulnerable. The power of his badge, his uniform, seemed insignificant now. What mattered more was the truth about how he had treated others, how he had failed to see beyond his own narrow perspective. The truth that was now staring him in the face. "Why didn't you just call me out on my behavior?" the officer asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why didn't you confront me right away?" The judge's eyes softened, a flicker of compassion crossing his face. "I didn't need to call you out. You were already questioning yourself. The truth was already in you, you just had to see it. The officer stood still, the words hanging in the air between them, heavier than any ticket he had ever written, more pressing than any law he had ever enforced. He had been confronted with the truth in a way he never expected, and now, there was no turning back. But the question lingered in his mind: what would he do now? Would he let this moment change him, or would he retreat into the comfort of his old beliefs? The judge didn't wait for the officer to answer. Instead, he gave him one final piece of advice, a life-changing lesson that the officer would carry with him forever. "Understand this, officer," the judge said quietly. "Justice isn't about power over others. It's about equality, about seeing people for who they truly are, not just what you think they are. And when you learn that, you'll truly be able to serve and protect." The officer's heart raced as he absorbed the weight of those words. He wasn't just being challenged as a cop. He was being challenged as a man, as a human being. And in that moment, he knew that everything was about to change. The officer stood in silence, his mind spinning. The judge's words echoed in his head like a constant hum, louder with every passing second. For so long, he had believed in his own authority, in the power of the badge he wore and the laws he upheld. But now, all of it seemed so hollow. The weight of the judge's lesson felt heavier than any responsibility he had ever carried before. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to shake off the feelings of doubt that had begun to settle in. He had always prided himself on being strong, tough enough to handle any situation, no matter how difficult or intimidating. But here, in front of this judge, he felt like nothing more than a child being taught a lesson. The judge, sensing the officer's inner turmoil, didn't speak immediately. He let the officer wrestle with his thoughts, knowing that sometimes the most important lessons were the ones that had to be processed in silence. But as the seconds ticked by, it became clear that the officer's internal battle was far from over. The officer clenched his fists, trying to hold on to the remnants of his old self. He had never been one to admit fault, especially not to someone he perceived as a stranger. And yet, the judge had made him confront a truth he had long avoided. How could he move forward, knowing that the power he had relied on for so long was now in question? "I can't just let go of everything I've been taught," the officer said, his voice strained. "I'm supposed to be in charge, to keep control. What kind of cop would I be if I suddenly start questioning everything?" The judge looked at him with a knowing expression. "That's the hardest part, isn't it? Letting go of what you thought you knew. But real strength doesn't come from control. It comes from the ability to evolve, to see the world for what it really is, not just what you've been taught to believe." The officer swallowed hard, his gaze flicking downward. He had always believed that to be a cop, he had to be unwavering, that showing vulnerability would make him weak. But now, standing in front of the judge, he wasn't sure if his rigid view of strength was what had truly made him strong all along. "I don't know if I can do that," the officer muttered. "It feels like I'm betraying everything I've worked for." The judge took a step closer, his voice steady but full of compassion. "You're not betraying anything. You're growing. And that's what this world needs more of, people who are willing to confront their mistakes and learn from them. It's not easy, but it's the only way to make things better." The officer felt a pang of guilt deep within him, but also a strange sense of relief. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of questioning his beliefs. He wasn't afraid to admit that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. The weight of the responsibility he had carried all these years, thinking he was above others, thinking he had all the answers, felt like a heavy burden now, one that he was no longer sure he wanted to carry. "You're right," the officer said, his voice softer now, less defensive. "But how do I start? How do I change when everything around me keeps telling me to stay the same?" The judge smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Start by acknowledging your mistakes, and then take responsibility for your actions. That's the first step. Once you do that, the rest will follow." The officer nodded slowly, his chest tight but his mind clearer than it had been in a long time. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be something he could fix overnight. But for the first time, he understood what the judge had been trying to teach him: real change starts with self-awareness. It starts with the willingness to face the uncomfortable truths and to use those truths to grow, to evolve. He could no longer hide behind the walls he had built. He had to confront his own prejudice, his own assumptions. And as he stood there, facing the judge, he realized that this was the beginning of a journey he never expected, a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, about power, and about justice. "Thank you," the officer said, his voice quiet but sincere. "For making me see what I couldn't see before." The judge nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting into a small, reassuring smile. "You're welcome. But remember, the real work starts now. You have a long road ahead of you, but the important thing is that you're on the right path. And that's what matters most." The officer took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like he was walking towards something better, a future where he could look at the world through a clearer lens, free from the biases that had clouded his judgment for so long. And as he walked away from the judge, he knew that he had been given more than just a lesson. He had been given a second chance. The power to change was now in his hands. And he wasn't going to waste it. The journey had only just begun. The officer walked back to his patrol car, the weight of the judge's words still heavy on his mind. Every step he took felt different, like the ground beneath him had shifted, and the world around him was now seen through a new lens. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the door handle of the car, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was the realization that he had been changed in a way he couldn't fully explain. He sat in the car for a long moment, his thoughts racing. What would his colleagues think if they knew? What would his superiors say if they found out he was questioning everything he had once believed in? He had spent so many years building his identity around being a by-the-book cop, someone who followed the rules without question, that the thought of stepping away from that image terrified him. But now, the fear wasn't about losing his identity as a cop, it was about losing his humanity, about continuing to let his biases dictate his actions. He closed his eyes, letting out a long breath, and ran his hand through his hair. It wasn't just about one traffic stop anymore. It was about everything. All the ways he had treated people in the past, treated them unfairly because of the color of their skin, their background, their history. The judge had shown him something he had never allowed himself to see before: his own biases were the true barrier to justice. The cop turned the key in the ignition, the engine humming to life. But as he put the car in gear and pulled away, he didn't just feel the road beneath him. He felt a new road ahead, one that was uncertain but full of promise. He didn't know exactly where it would lead, but for the first time, he was ready to walk it. He drove aimlessly for a while, unsure of where to go next. He couldn't shake the image of the judge's face, calm and resolute, teaching him a lesson that he hadn't asked for but desperately needed. The judge's strength hadn't come from his position or authority, it had come from his ability to see beyond the surface and to demand more from others. To demand that they see the world as it truly was, not as they wished it to be. The cop's thoughts were interrupted by the buzzing of his radio. He picked it up reluctantly, still deep in thought. It was a call, a routine stop, nothing out of the ordinary. But for the first time, the officer hesitated before responding. He didn't just hear the words, he heard the people behind them. He remembered the judge's lesson: justice wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about understanding the human beings on the other side of that law. As he drove toward the scene, a decision began to form in his mind. This wasn't going to be like all the other stops. This wasn't going to be just about following protocol. This time, he was going to take the time to see the person he was dealing with, to understand their story, to acknowledge their humanity. He arrived at the scene and approached the vehicle cautiously. The driver was a middle-aged man, scruffy and nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his license and registration. But instead of snapping orders, the officer took a deep breath and approached him differently this time. "Everything okay, sir?" the officer asked, his voice calm, his tone respectful. The man looked up at him, startled by the question. Yeah, officer. Everything's fine. Just a little nervous, I guess." The officer nodded, sensing the tension in the air. But instead of rushing through the exchange, he decided to engage in a way he never had before. He asked the man about his day, about his life. The conversation wasn't about the ticket, it was about the person in front of him. The more they talked, the more the officer realized that this man wasn't just a driver or a suspect. He was someone with struggles, fears, and experiences that the officer had never stopped to consider. By the end of the stop, the officer let the man go with a warning. But it wasn't just the ticket that mattered. It was the connection they had made, the human understanding that had passed between them. The officer realized, for the first time, that the job he had taken for granted, the job that had defined his identity, was more than just enforcing the rules. It was about understanding, compassion, and human connection. As the man drove off, the officer stood there for a moment, watching the car disappear into the distance. He had no idea where his journey would take him from here. He didn't know what the future held, but he was no longer afraid of it. He had been given a new perspective, one that had opened his eyes to the world around him in a way he never thought possible. And in that moment, he understood what the judge had meant. The true power didn't lie in the badge or the uniform, it lay in his ability to change, to see beyond the surface, and to serve the community with a heart open to growth. The officer drove back to the station, his heart a little lighter than when he had left. He didn't know how to explain the shift he felt inside, but he knew that from now on, he would be a different kind of cop. A better kind. And that made all the difference. The officer sat in his patrol car, parked in the quiet corner of the station parking lot, long after his shift had ended. The world around him seemed still, but his mind was racing. The events of the day, the encounter with the judge, and the realization that had followed, were like a storm, one that had reshaped everything he had thought he knew about himself. His thoughts kept drifting back to that moment, to the judge's calm but piercing words. He had never imagined that a simple traffic stop would lead to a life-changing revelation. The weight of his prejudices had been lifted, but in its place, a new responsibility had emerged, a responsibility to not just uphold the law, but to truly understand it. To recognize that justice wasn't something you could enforce by force, it was something you had to embody, something you had to live. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the changes he needed to make, but he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't go back to who he was before. That part of him was gone, replaced by a new man who could see beyond the surface, who could approach people with empathy, understanding, and respect. The officer thought about his colleagues, the other men and women in his department. He had spent years believing that being tough, unquestioning, and detached was the only way to be a good cop. But now, he realized how wrong he had been. He had seen people as cases, as problems to be solved, never as human beings. He had walked past countless stories without ever stopping to listen. But the truth was, every person he encountered had a story, one that mattered. The officer had come to a crossroads. He could continue down the path he had been on, keeping his distance from the world and those around him. Or he could embrace the truth he had learned, face the uncomfortable realities of his past, and be the change he wished to see in the world. He thought about the judge again, how calm he had been, how patient, how willing to face the truth without fear. It was a strength the officer had never fully understood, but now it was something he aspired to. The officer had always prided himself on doing things the right way, by the book, never questioning his role. But now, he saw the cracks in that approach. Justice couldn't be served by blindly following the rules, it had to be served with compassion. It had to be served with an understanding that everyone, regardless of their past or their circumstances, deserved to be treated with dignity. And so, the officer made a decision. He wouldn't just change how he interacted with others. He would change how he saw the world, how he approached his job. He would no longer be defined by his uniform or his badge, he would be defined by his actions, by the respect he showed every person he met, and by his willingness to evolve. The next morning, as he arrived for his shift, he walked into the station with a new sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be days when it would feel like everything was working against him. But he also knew that the most important work wasn't the kind you could do with a badge, it was the kind you did with your heart. He walked past his colleagues, offering a small, genuine smile to each one. They looked at him with curiosity, but he didn't feel the need to explain himself just yet. He was still learning, still growing, but he knew that change started with small actions, small shifts in behavior. It was about showing respect, about listening, about taking responsibility for his own part in a broken system. As he walked through the station, his eyes fell on the bulletin board, filled with news clippings and reminders of the cases he had worked on. But today, they looked different to him, less like assignments and more like stories waiting to be understood. He could feel the weight of them, the lives behind the headlines, and it reminded him of the true reason he had chosen this path. The officer made a promise to himself that day: he would be a cop who saw the humanity in everyone. He would be a cop who fought not just for the letter of the law, but for the spirit of it. He would be a cop who helped to heal, not just enforce. As the day went on, he had encounters with a few civilians. And for the first time in his career, he didn't just see them as suspects or troublemakers. He saw them as people who had their own struggles, their own stories. The small exchanges that had once been routine felt different now. He listened more. He understood more. And in return, they responded differently. The power dynamic had shifted. He had nothing to prove. He just had something real to offer: respect. By the end of the shift, the officer was exhausted, but for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing: the journey he was on had just begun. And for the first time in his life, he was excited to walk it. As he drove home that night, he glanced at the rearview mirror. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew he was no longer the same man who had stared back at him from that mirror years ago. He had learned to see the world through new eyes, eyes that were open to change, to growth, and to the power of empathy.